Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So now what can be done? Most obvious thing is the existing zombie banks cannot finance a recovery. They're supposed to be the source of capital for productive investment, for plant and equipment, for the creation of new jobs. These zombie banks cannot do it. The zombie banks are all teetering on the brink of failure. We've seen it, right? Bank of America, Citibank, JPM, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, all teetering, all stock prices heavily impacted. And when something in Europe blows, they will blow too, maybe a few days later. So forget about organizing a recovery through the existing banking system. What's got to happen to those zombie banks is the application of the bankruptcy laws. In other words, junk too big to fail. Those are black holes. They will suck in any amount of credit you create. It doesn't matter. We've seen it. $24 trillion, theoretically, of credit made available to them, and now they're all back on the brink of bankruptcy 3 years after the main crisis. So this cannot work. What does work? Well, let's go back to Germany once again. But when it comes to theory, it's clear we got to look to Germany, to the people who have come up with the theory of this. And unfortunately, they never got to put it into practice. That was sort of done in the U.S. But we're talking W.S. Voitinsky, actually a Russian, a Menshevik, a left-wing social democrat from Russia. He fled because he wasn't a Bolshevik. He was a Menshevik. He became the key economist for the German Trade Union Federation. So there's a leftist. And then we've got Wilhelm Lautenbach, a conservative, and I mean conservative, not reactionary, but conservative public servant who was concerned about his country, German patriot. And the two of them converge on the same thing. You force the central bank to issue billions of marks in those days, I would say an initial tranche of $1 trillion, and that is used to finance massive infrastructure spending. Now, that's the theory. We can also look back theoretically to the New Deal, and from the New Deal we get a number of things. You get things like, the Fraser-Lemke Act that essentially stabilize your people in their homes by letting them stay in their homes. You essentially stop foreclosures. If you can get any kind of a payment deal that can be approved by any judge, then they stay, and the banks can hold their horses for the duration of the crisis. But we also have to look at the fact that the culmination of the New Deal is actually Lend-Lease. The Lend-Lease law, introduced in the famous Garden Hose speech by Franklin D. Roosevelt, December 1940. After winning a third term, he says, I'm going to have Lend-Lease. The United States will lend to or lease to the Allies, essentially. At that point, it was Britain and China. Soon, Soviets were added. Military equipment. Naturally, the Republicans didn't want that. They said it's like chewing gum. You don't want it back. You can't lend it. You can't lease it. The Lend-Lease is the thing that gets control of the Federal Reserve credit mechanism in ways that they're written up in Surviving the Cataclysm. And again, you can't understand anything if you don't read Surviving the Cataclysm. But essentially, anybody who had a valid defense contract could take that to a bank and get immediate working capital. And the Federal Reserve was required by law to discount that bill. They had to provide cash on that contract. So in effect, and this was recognized by even by such a fellow as Sir Winston Churchill, who was probably the biggest, one of the single biggest beneficiaries of this, that it was Lend-Lease that harnessed the engine of credit creation to the war effort. So if it can be done under those terrible conditions in 1940, 1941, let's do it now and get an economic recovery. The other thing we want to look back to is that Franklin D. Roosevelt nationalized de facto the Federal Reserve. And my biggest criticism of Roosevelt is that he only did this informally. He did it informally from 1933 to 1942. He did it more formally from 1942 past the end of his life until 1951 it lasted. And essentially what it meant is from 1942 on, under the pressure of the war effort, the Federal Reserve was told, you, Fed, will buy Treasury bond issues that will give us a yield of 3/8%, less than 0.5% on the short-term 1 to 2 year paper and short-term bills even less of the U.S. Treasury. So this was a de facto nationalization. Now, it's hard to find people writing about this. They mainly write about when it ended. There's a series of articles from the Richmond branch of the U.S. Federal Reserve, which I'll refer to when I publish this stuff. But this is the famous agreement, the Treasury-Fed Accord of March 4th, 1951, between McCabe, the head of the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board at that time, Thomas B. McCabe, Truman appointee, and Secretary of the Treasury John W. Snyder of the Truman administration. And they say, all right, from now on, the Federal Reserve will not be forced by the Treasury to buy the Treasury bond auctions at a specific rate. Now, this is obviously a monstrosity. That's the Korean War. But the bankers don't care, right? They want to pursue looting. They don't care about the fate of the nation. That's a constant with these people, right? Oligarchs hate the nation state, always have. So this is the background. Now, therefore, what do we have to do? The Federal Reserve is, in many ways, lawless. It's unconstitutional. And in this program, we've argued repeatedly, the way you solve the problem of the central bank like this is to nationalize it. And what that means is that their policies have got to be determined by law, passed by the House, passed by the Senate, signed by the President. Public law. That's got to govern the credit issue, how much credit will be issued, the percentage rates, interest rates, the approved categories of lending. Every other feature has got to be defined by law. But we don't have that now. So what can we do? Let's take the lawlessness and make this into an advantage. Let's force the, quote, independent, unquote, Federal Reserve to do what we want them to do. Now, this can be done from the White House, yeah. I think somebody like Biden would be capable of, he could articulate a speech put in front of him. I think Obama is probably so discredited by now that he'd have a very hard time launching anything. But if you could get Obama out, suppose you had Biden. Biden could read a teleprompter saying, I am directing Chairman Bernanke of the Federal Reserve, and he has agreed in our telephone conversation last night. Chairman Bernanke has agreed to buy $1 trillion of bonds that will be issued by American states and by authorities like the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, and other such authorities that may be constituted by the states for the building of infrastructure, to rebuild the entire interstate highway system, including all of its bridges, on a priority high-speed basis. We're going to build a new high-speed rail system, transcontinental, East Coast, West Coast, Gulf Coast, Chicago to New Orleans, and from Chicago to St. Louis to Denver and so forth, to the Intermountain West and so forth. In other words, to rebuild the entire railway system, to rebuild the entire canals and water systems of the United States, to reactivate the New York State Barge Canal, the entire Mississippi, Missouri, Tennessee, Ohio River canal systems, all of that rebuilt, all the dams rebuilt. We've even got Rachel Maddow on MSNBC has discovered the Boulder Dam, Hoover Dam there in the West. So the president can force the head of the Federal Reserve to do this. In other words, it's a lawless situation. A president, maybe not this one, but a president, or maybe even this one under certain conditions, could be forced to do this. Otherwise, a movement in Congress could do it. If enough congressmen demanded this, this could be done. The Progressive Caucus is 70 or 80 people in the House. There are some people like that in the Senate, too. They could get out there and say, we demand that Bernanke open up a Main Street credit facility with $1 trillion for infrastructure, roads, bridges, rail, water systems, electrical grid, and so forth. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio.